Last week, Ron Tucker preached a sermon to you about weathering the storms of life, and I watched the sermon, and it was profound. I want to take it a step further. Instead of just talking about the general storms of life, I want to talk about the perfect storm of life. And as a point of reference for us today, I want to take you to the beauty and the tragedy that took place in the Garden of Gethsemane, that awful night that Jesus was betrayed just prior to his crucifixion. So I'm going to be reading a passage from there in a moment. It's a well-known one, and I'm fully aware I'm walking on holy ground, so we'll treat this with all the reverence that I possibly can. But there is a dilemma that faces many of us, and that is the dilemma of forgetfulness. My wife will tell you she's married to one of the most forgetful people in the world. She'll tell me one thing 1 minute, and a minute later I'm in trouble because I haven't heard or listened or fulfilled that which she'd asked me to do. I'm just a forgetful person, but I don't think I'm the only one. I wish there was a course out there that forgetful people could go on. I remember in the early days when we were trying to remember stuff, when we used to wear ties. Do you remember those days? Nobody wears a tie anymore, or very few do. We would tie a knot in our tie, do you remember? And that would remind me that I have something to remember, but then I forgot what I meant to remember, and I'm in a bad way. And so we had these little techniques of writing on our hands, on the back of a box or a piece of paper, but there was no foolproof way in order to learn how to remember stuff. So from a technique, it turned to technology, and now you have alarm clocks, and you have cell phones, and you have computers, all in an endeavor to help you to remember. Now, back in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a beautiful song that was written about this, that was written back in the 1950s, and it was a song simply that said, "Lest I forget Gethsemane." You see, people, there are some things that we need to forget, but our tragedy of our situation is we remember the things we meant to forget, and we forget the things that we meant to remember. And Jesus told a parable about a man like that. He owed the king a lot of money. The king called him in and said, "Pay up." He couldn't pay. So the king forgave him his debt. The man left rejoicing, and he walked out, and somebody was following him. And he walked out, and he saw across the street somebody who owed him a tiny, minuscule amount of money compared to what he had owed the king. And so he runs across the road, and he begins to throttle this man, saying, pay up the little that you owe me." Anyway, the man who was following him, Jesus said, went back into the presence of the king. He was probably shaking his head in confusion as to what he'd just seen. So the king says, "What's your problem?" He says, "Sir, you won't understand. You won't believe what I've just seen. You know that man that you forgave a huge debt to? Well, sir, he's outside throttling somebody to death who owes him but a few dollars. He's obviously forgotten what he needs to remember, and he's now remembering what he needs to forget." We are forgetful people. Now, there are consequences to our forgetfulness, even in normal life. Has anybody here forgotten an anniversary? Those of you who are married, there are consequences to your forgetfulness. You will all know that. We kind of forget the things that we should remember the things that we forget. There are some in the Bible, as we call them famous forgetters. Famous forgetters. People like the children of Israel, who came out of the bondage of Egypt into the promised land and through the wilderness. And in Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses confronts these people by saying to them, "You have forgotten God." And I'm reading this and I'm saying, how do you forget God if you're an Israelite? You have witnessed as God has supernaturally delivered you through the Red Sea. You have witnessed the miracle of manna every day for 40 years. You have witnessed the victory over incredible enemies. How do you ever forget God when God does that stuff for you? But apparently in our humanity, we do that with ease. That's why Jesus came and he said to his disciples, he said, "I need you to take communion as often as you do this in remembrance of me." Jesus knew that we had short memories. That's why from time to time we need to remember to remember. There are some things in my life that I never want to forget. I come from a little town called Zimbabwe, a little country called Zimbabwe, and in our little town, I lived there as my high school years, and it was during that time that I committed my life to follow Jesus. Every time I visit Zimbabwe and drive through that little town, I always take time to go to that little church where this all happened. Many years ago, 50 years ago, this happened. And I still visit this little chapel in this little church, and I sit in the same chair that I sat in that night when that man preached that sermon that just convinced me that I needed to follow Jesus. And I will take time and go into that chapel, and I will sit there, and I remember the things that have changed my life, because there hasn't been a day since that day that has not been affected by what took place that day. Every day has been affected by the decision I made when I was about 12, 13 years old. And then I'll go behind the curtain where a man counseled me and led me to Jesus, and I prayed to receive Christ. I never want to forget that day. And so I will go through this little, call it a ritual, in order to remember better that which God has done for me. So getting back to this hymn, Lest I Forget Gethsemane, was written by a lady by the name of Jenny Hussey. And I want to read to you the story of Gethsemane. It's a great story. I'm going to read from Mark's account of this event, Mark chapter 14, beginning at verse 32. Listen carefully. They went to a place called Gethsemane. This is after the Last Supper. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for just 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and he prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priest and the teachers of the law and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you and teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scripture must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. That's an incredible story of the perfect storm. The culmination of the enemies of God, the demonic forces, culminating with the wonder of the plan of God, culminating along with the sinfulness of human beings and the wonder of the love of God, all culminated in the Garden of Gethsemane to have the perfect storm. Now, to begin with, I'd like to just draw a simple little picture for you, and it looks something like this. We all know that Jesus died upon a hill, did he not? Call it the hill of Calvary. And when you look at that hill of Calvary and you see the cross thereon, you realize that Jesus came for one purpose primarily. I know he did a lot of good things when he was a great teacher. He was a great philosopher. He was a great healer. He was a great leader. He was everything. But Jesus came specifically under the plan of God to die upon a cross, to take upon himself the sin of the world. That was the ultimate and primary purpose of Jesus coming to this world. And so you have the purpose of God being center stage over here. But here's what's so interesting. In order for Jesus to get to the perfect purpose of God, he had to go through this place called Gethsemane. I'll just put a G there. In order for you to fulfill the purpose of God, you may well have to go through a Gethsemane as well. You see, a Gethsemane always precedes the purpose of God being fulfilled. That's why this sermon is so applicable to each one of us. That's why what took place in the Garden of Gethsemane is real for us as well. Now, might I suggest to you that there are basically two types of Gethsemane. The first type of Gethsemane is the Gethsemane of life. This is the kind of thing that happens to us because we live in a fallen world. Stuff happens that trashes us, and we go through incredible times of heaviness and despondency and sadness. And when you look at Gethsemane, you see that it is a number of things. And the first thing that Gethsemane is it's a place of heaviness. It's an incredible heaviness in this garden as the weight of the sin of the world was upon Jesus. And he was crushed beneath the weight. And out of him came the drops of blood that he sweat there that day. You know what Gethsemane means? It actually means, in the original language, the place of heaviness. It means the oil press. That's what Gethsemane means. And they would take olives, and they would put them in a big hole, and they would roll these enormous rocks on top of them, and then they would just leave them. And over the course of time, those rocks would crush those olives, and out from the side would come this most beautiful oil, all under the weight of incredible heaviness. Jesus suffered in the Garden of Gethsemane a similar fate to the olives. He crushed under the weight of the sin of the world. Your sin was in there. My sin was in that weight that Jesus carried in the garden. The emotional heaviness must have been incredible. Now, when I talk about this type of heaviness as it relates to the heaviness of life, I'm not talking about in our situation the fact that someone cut you off in traffic. You know, we get angry about that. That's not the kind of heaviness I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the heaviness that comes because somebody jumps the queue or takes too long in a 10 line, in a 10 item, they've got 12 items and you get upset about that. You know, I'm not talking about that kind of heaviness. I'm not talking about the kind of heaviness that comes when your kid comes home with a poor report card. I'm not talking about that superficial kind of pain. But I'm talking today about the agony of a soul that understands the brokenness that comes from being told that you're dying of a terrible disease. And you enter into the gates of Gethsemane, your own Gethsemane. I'm talking about the weight that comes upon the guy who's just received his divorce papers from his wife that he loves. And he enters into the gate of his own Gethsemane. I'm talking about the weight that comes upon somebody who loses a child and they come into their own Gethsemane. It's a place of incredible heaviness where you go to sleep with tears and you still wake up crying. That's the nature of Gethsemane of life. And if it hasn't happened to you, it may well still be in the future for you. We all will go through these Gethsemanes of life. But the second type of Gethsemane is the Gethsemane of God. This is one where you experience the same brokenness, but for a different reason. You experience the brokenness of your soul as you witness the brokenness of humanity around you. I can remember this in my own experience, standing at the bedside of a young man in our church who I'd befriended, who was dying of HIV and AIDS. And I stood at his bedside and I was helpless to help him. I could not fix this. I thought I could fix anything. But as this young man died, crying out to me for help, "Trevor, help me, I'm dying," I could do nothing. And that day I entered into my own Gethsemane. And I took my wife with me and a few other people, and we experienced the brokenness of getting under the burden of God for the humanity of this broken, messed up, trashed world. And when you see the sadness, you will never be the same again. You might see it on TV and quickly change the channel because you don't want to see it anymore. But as I witnessed this death of this young man in our congregation, and I've seen many people die, but this death just shook me to the core. But let me tell you this, that in order for my purpose in life to be fulfilled, I had to go through that Gethsemane. It broke me. The heaviness lasted for days. And you know what? I still carry it. I still carry that burden of that heaviness. It's a burden I will never, ever put down and never want to put down. And when you get under the burden of the brokenness of suffering and poverty and crime and injustice and messed up families and dysfunctional homes and lost kids, you begin to realize what this is all about. There is a heaviness. Nehemiah, that wonderful guy in the Old Testament, he experienced this. When he heard about the broken walls of Jerusalem, he broke. And he had never been to Jerusalem before. But that didn't matter, because God took the burden of God and he laid it upon Nehemiah. And he said, Nehemiah, you will now carry my burden for those broken walls and those messed up people. And Nehemiah carried well the burden of God. That's the Gethsemane of God. The second thing about this place of Gethsemane, not only is it a place of heaviness, but it's a place of loneliness as well. Gethsemane is a place that you come to with others, but it's not long before you find out that you're in fact all alone. Jesus came to his Gethsemane with his disciples. His closest friends were there. But it wasn't long before Jesus knew that he was alone. When his friends fell asleep, and Jesus pleaded with them, says, guys, can't you just stay awake 1 hour? Can't you just pray with me through this terrible tragedy and this heaviness? Can't you just pray with me? And the disciples, with good intention, may well have said, okay, Jesus, we'll try that. We can do that. But it wasn't long before Jesus knew he was all alone, because they fell asleep and they were tired and they had not really understood what Jesus was saying. In fact, probably in their minds, they were saying, oh, Jesus, get over it. Jesus is not that bad. They're not going to kill you, Jesus. You're going to be fine, Jesus. We're all tired. Jesus, let us have a nap. And under the complacency of what they were having, Jesus bore the burden and the heaviness of Gethsemane totally alone. Loneliness is a terrible, terrible thing. Counseling officers are full of people who have understood rejection from a child. I didn't get an invitation to the party. All my friends got an invitation to the party, but they never invited me. I stayed at home all alone while I knew that the party was going on next door, says the little 9-year-old kid. So he has his own party, he invites all the guys, but nobody comes. And he feels the pain of rejection and being all alone. Can you identify with that one in the point of your Gethsemane? Face it, people, even when you're in the presence of others, you can still be all alone when you're in your Gethsemane. Thirdly, Gethsemane is a place of opposition. Opposition. The intriguing thing is, no one's suggesting that people are not going to oppose us in our lives. That would be very naive to think that that may happen. But the opposition, it's the source of this opposition that is intriguing. The opposition in Gethsemane came from the scribes and the Pharisees and the readers of the law and the elders. They should have known better. They should have known that there's this Jesus who the Old Testament had prophesied about many times, that this could well be the man. They knew the Pentateuch, they knew the law, they knew everything. They knew the pictures that portrayed Jesus in the Old Testament. They'd seen the prophecies of Jesus, that there will come a man who will come out of a little town called Bethlehem, and he will be the Messiah. They had read about how back in the Garden of Eden that one day someone would come who would stamp upon the head of the snake, and the snake would bruise his heel, but he would crush his head. They had read it all. But sometimes those who oppose you most are those who believe the least, even though they have all the information that they need. Jesus had names for people like this. The scribes and the Pharisees, he called them in Matthew chapter 23, he spoke harshly about them. He called them whitewashed sepulchres. He said, you look good on the outside, but inside you just messed up, you smell. Matthew 3, he calls them blind guides. He called them snakes. He called them a brood of vipers. You see, people, here's the truth. The greatest opposition to the move of God into where God wants you to go is not from the outside. They don't really care. In fact, many places where we come from, they're crying out for the church to do this. The greatest opposition is not outside. The greatest opposition, tragically, is inside the church, where people are more interested in systems than they are in vision, where people in the church are more interested in what procedures need to be followed. Procedures. And they forget about the passion of people for lost souls. There are many within the walls of the building who want religion rather than relationships. The greatest enemy of the church is not out there, it's inside the church. Have a look at the disciples in the boat in the midst of the storm. And there they are being tossed up and down, but they see Jesus. Everybody saw Jesus. So Peter's seeing Jesus, says, Jesus, call me and I'll come to you and walk on the water. Jesus said, come. And tell those other guys to come with you. I'm sure he said too. And then Peter says, hey guys, Jesus says we can go and walk on water. Come, let's go. And the guy's saying, no. Have you seen how big the waves are? We've never walked on water before, Peter. We've never seen anybody walk on water until now when we see Jesus. And the greatest enemy to walking on water was not the waves on the outside, but was the wimps on the inside of the boats. The waves are not a threat to us, people. The wimps on the inside of the church, they're the ones who are our greatest opposition. Gets worse than that. Opposition turns in the Garden of Gethsemane into blatant betrayal by a friend, and with a kiss. His friend came to Jesus and he kissed him. That's an act of respect. That's an act of intimacy. That's an act of affection. It's an act of incredible friendship. And he betrayed him with a kiss. He didn't even need to point Jesus out. They knew who Jesus was. And Jesus told them that. Hey guys, you know who I am. Why do you need to betray me with a kiss? But Judas did it anyway. There's an Old Testament parallel to this, you know. As you look in the book of Job and you see Job going through his own Gethsemane, his own suffering and his own confusion as to why he's suffering the way he is. He's in a real Gethsemane. And at the point of when he's at his very lowest, the one who should have supported him the most became the one who would betray him. That's the truth in Gethsemane. And what happened was Job's wife, one who should have stood with him and said, Job, you're going to be fine. We're going to get through this thing together, came to Job and said, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? And the agony of being stabbed in the back by his own wife was an act of incredible betrayal. I wonder if you identify with this. Maybe your betrayal has come in the shape of the form of a spouse. Maybe your betrayal came in the form of a family member or a business partner or a friend or some leader, somebody that you loved and respected, ended up being the source of your greatest pain. The fifth thing that I want to suggest to you is that Gethsemane is the place of a full cup. You see, as I read the Bible, I see that there are two cups referred to. We have the cup that David talks about in Psalm 23, where he also talks about the cup of blessing that overflows. God has blessed me so much, my cup is just overflowing. But then we also have another cup. I think it's the same cup, but it's full of different stuff. The cup of blessing is no longer there. Now it's become the cup of suffering. And this is part of the Christian experience. I was talking to Ron the other day and saying, we need a better theology on suffering. The church needs to come to a better theology because we've taught people only one side of the truth. We want to talk about God's blessing. People, there is a cup of suffering that happens in the Garden of Gethsemane of your life. It's part of God's plan. And then we have the next one aspect is this Gethsemane is a place of deep prayer, of heartfelt prayer, of prayer that comes not even with words but with groans that can barely be uttered because of the pain that you are going through. You don't even have words, you just have sounds. And the Holy Spirit takes those sounds and he interprets them to the Father and says, he's going through his Gethsemane, Father, those groans mean this. And God gets to know what your groan of your heart is all about. It's a place of deep, heart-wrenching prayer. In Jesus' prayer, there were two aspects to it. How interesting is this? First aspect of Jesus' prayer is where he cries out, Father, can this cup be taken from me, this cup of suffering? Can you take the cup from me? And then he prays the second prayer. He says, but Father, not my will, but your will be done. In Luke's account of this same incident, there is a ministering angel that comes to minister to Jesus. I wonder if the ministering angel didn't come between the two prayers. If the ministering angel did not change the shape or the words of the second prayer. The first prayer, Father, take this cup from me. And the ministering angel came, and all of a sudden that which was take the cup from me became, God, let your will be done through the power and the presence of a ministering angel. Oh, people, when you are in your Gethsemane, I pray for the presence of a ministering angel. It may not be an angel from heaven, but it could be an angel from down the road. It could be an angel from your family, from your community. Someone who just draws alongside you and says, I understand your pain. I can't fix it, but I'm going to journey with you through this thing. And that which was once the prayer of, Lord, take this cup from me, it's unbearable, suddenly turns uniquely to, Father, your will be done through the ministry of some ministering angel. I pray that happen for you. And then we see that Gethsemane is a place of good intentions. Peter had some good intentions in the garden. We read in the passage we read that Peter took out his sword and he chopped off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus turned to Peter and said, Peter, there's good intentions, man. Your intentions are good, but it's really not helpful right now that you do this. Put your sword back, and he heals the man. There are people that will come to you in your Gethsemane. They have good intentions, but what they have to offer you is very unhelpful. They'll try and persuade you that there's another way through this Gethsemane. There's a shortcut. If you just come out this way, you can get out of your own Gethsemane. That's what Peter was trying to do. And they will come with good intentions, but at the end of the day, they're just not helpful. You know where some of the greatest Gethsemanes come? Is in at funeral services. I see this is part of the Gethsemane of many people's lives. And whenever I do a funeral, I'll always warn the people who have lost a loved one. I say, guys, just before you go into this funeral, you need to forgive people in advance for the stupid things they're going to say to you. You know, they come with good intentions, but the stuff they say is not helpful and certainly not true. I've heard people at funerals say to someone who's grieving, to say, oh, do not worry. You know, God needed another angel in heaven. And I'm thinking, that's not true. God's got plenty of angels. The guy's got good intentions, but it's certainly not helpful. Or what about this one? God needed us, your son or your friend or whatever it is now another star in the sky. And I mean, I don't think that's true either. God's got plenty of stars. He doesn't take somebody from you and make him a star in heaven. The guy's got good intentions, but what he has to say is just not helpful at all. So there will come people into your Gethsemane with good intentions who may try and encourage you on a short way out of there. Let me move on to this thing. How many have we done? Can't remember. Let's suggest this. Gethsemane is for many people just a test. It's just a test. Two aspects to this test. The objective of it being a test is that you should pass the test. Don't fail the Gethsemane test. In Isaiah 50, verse 11, God tells them what not to do in their Gethsemane. He says this, but now, all you who light fires and provide yourself with flaming torches, go walk in the light of your fires and of the torches you have yourself set ablaze. This is what you shall receive from my hand. You will lie down in torment. Don't make your own way out of Gethsemane. Don't light your own fires to get you through this darkness, because it's just going to make it worse. A Gethsemane is a time where you walk through and you allow time to be your healer, and you allow the ministering angel to come in to encourage you through this particular time. Oh man, we need a better theology on suffering. Second thing you need to do in the garden is you need to keep hope alive. Hope must not die with you in the garden. Keep it alive. Let me tell you why. In Hebrews chapter 12, this is how Jesus got through his Gethsemane. This is what Hebrews 12 says. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross and despised the shame and sat up at the right hand of the Father. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. So while Jesus was in Gethsemane and while Jesus was hanging on the cross, he did that because he knew that something good was about to happen. And it was the future that determined his mindset in the present. If the future determines how we feel now, we will understand the joy. That's why we need a vision. The Hebrew prophet says that those without a vision, what happens to them? They die. And it's a very miserable death. They die in Gethsemane. You're not meant to die in Gethsemane, people. You're meant to go through Gethsemane. To fulfill the purpose of God for your life, you have to get through Gethsemane. The two are related. But the way you get through this is because you have to have a vision for the other side. We all know that the resurrection took place and the ascension of Jesus to the right hand of the Father. For the joy set before me, he endured the cross, he despised the shame of Gethsemane, and he sat down at the right hand of the Father. It was the joy set in front of him that enabled him to endure the suffering that he went through. He kept hope alive. That's the first thing that we understand about this. The last thing that I'm going to suggest to you is that Gethsemane is not just a test, but here's the deal. Gethsemane is a gift. It's not a gift that God gives to you for you. It's a gift that God gives to you for him. How many of you, when you have kids and the kids are small and they're going to buy you a Christmas present, and they come and say, Dad, I'm going to buy you a present, I need some money. So you give them money to buy you a present. And God does that with us. He gives us money. He gives us a burden. He gives us something to carry that we can go out there and invest so that one day we can take that burden and we can present it back to God as a gift. He puts a deposit down in our lives and He gives us a purpose that we have to go through Gethsemane to fulfill. And when we carry the burden of God, man, you know what happens? And when we carry it well, at the end of our lives, when we cross from this life to the next, we get to present to God the beauty of the gift of suffering that He has given to us. Whether it be suffering because of something else that somebody's done to you or suffering because of the burden for humanity, it's a gift that you present back to God, but it can get heavy along the way. Think of this. If you've ever watched TV, you've watched those big, strong men on TV. They have these competitions, different types, but the one competition is where they have these big concrete balls that weigh hundreds of pounds. And these enormous men come and they wrap their hands around these enormous concrete balls, and they lift them up like this. And they carry them toward a pedestal. And they're tempted to drop the ball. It is so heavy. They're tempted, but with grit, they go and they get it in. And then they stand in front of the pedestal. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? Okay, you've seen it. Okay, and then they lift these things up, and with last heave, they wham! And they stick it on the pedestal. You've seen that. Watch their face. And they stand back. And they look and say, how did I do? And the crowd's applauding, and the granny's on her feet, and she's so excited as he has placed his burden upon the pedestal. He stood back with great satisfaction and said, how do I do? How did I do? People, there'll come a day. We'll all stand before God, and we'll do the same thing. We will take that burden that God has given to us for whatever it may be. I know what mine is. I hope you know what yours is. And I will carry that, my wife and I, we will dump it. We're going to say, God, how did we do? I'm returning to you the gift that you gave me, and I hope it's okay. I really pray, people, if you don't have that burden, go and get one. God wants to give you one. Take up your cross and follow Him. Don't leave it behind. Don't drop it. Carry it through you with life. And then one day you will hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. Let's pray. Father, we're so aware of our need of you. We're so aware of what you went through in that garden, that fateful night, where you bore the burden of the sin of mankind. You did it alone. Your friends left you. They deserted you. You were betrayed. There was opposition, not from without as much as from within. But Lord, you bore that burden and you offered it back to the Father as you fulfilled your purpose. And your Father must have been so proud of you. You achieved all that He wanted to achieve. Thank you that you did that on our behalf. Amen.